Thank you. So the first thing I want to do before I actually start is to take a straw poll. How many people in the room have a medical background? Okay. I think what I wanted to do today was to give a little bit of an overview of how the project came about, as I think putting some background around it might help frame why we think this is, well, for me, the most provocative thing I've been involved with in my medical career. So heart failure, and the way that we look at heart failure in Canada is it is an epidemic. There are about 500,000 Canadians right now who suffer from heart failure, and there are about 50,000 new cases diagnosed each year. And a lot of people, when you tell them they have heart failure, they say, well, thank God I don't have cancer, when in actual fact, that is exactly the opposite of the way they should be thinking about it. If we look at the average life expectancy after the diagnosis of heart failure, it's 2.1 years, 1.8 years for men, and about 3.2 years for women after the diagnosis. So that within the first year, about 25 to 40% of people who are diagnosed will die. And once you're over the age of 40, put your hand up, you have a 1 in 5 lifetime risk of developing heart failure. So that death from heart failure is more common than that from breast cancer, HIV, and other forms of cancer combined. And a lot of people don't really understand that impact. The patients that we sort of draw from are patients who have what we call advanced heart failure. And by that, and you have to put yourself into the position that the patients are in, they're short of breath doing anything. They're short of breath trying to brush their teeth. They're short of breath getting dressed. They're short of breath eating. Many of them will be short of breath even just resting. They can't sleep at night. It's like they're drowning in their own fluids. Because the heart is not pumping adequately, the remainder of their body doesn't function properly either. So many of them will have cognitive impairment. They won't be able to do simple arithmetic that would have been nothing to them before. And these patients with this type of condition, in our world, we think of them as being patients that the symptoms are so bad that they need something pretty amazing to actually make them feel better or to live longer. There are 2 ways that patients with advanced heart failure die, and I'm being provocative purposefully. So one is drowning, which means that they just slowly do drown in their own fluids, and this happens usually when somebody develops advanced heart failure. This can happen over the course of hours, but can actually happen over the course of days, weeks, and months, but generally not longer than about 6 months. Or they can die from sudden death. Many patients, when you talk to them, would prefer dying from sudden death than dying from drowning. And unfortunately, when you actually develop more advanced heart failure, you're much more likely to die from drowning than you are from sudden death. So this is really what they're facing every day. So transplant is a miracle for these patients, and it is a way for them to have a second opportunity at life, and it is a way for them to prolong their life, and it is definitely a way for them to feel better. Many of the patients will have this done to them, and the group will probably be doing some work on this in the future as well. And these are types of mechanical hearts. And you know, how patients feel when they have one might be a little unusual. But many of our patients will have a mechanical heart before they actually go on and do the transplant. But to set the stage, I told you that there are 500,000 Canadians with severe heart failure, or with heart failure, and 5% have severe heart failure. So that's 25,000 patients right now in Canada with severe advanced heart failure. And in the whole country, we do 180 transplants a year for the whole country. And we do about 80 mechanical hearts a year. So if you do the math, that's 48,740 Canadians who have no life-saving option, and half of them will be dead in the next 6 months. So when we see a patient and we bring them forward for transplant, they know that they are awaiting the lottery of life. They know that because the likelihood is they have a 30% chance of dying waiting. The vast majority will never even get to the transplant list. And so there is this feeling for patients that they're waiting and actually dying while they're waiting for their next opportunity. So that's sort of the background. And what happened was this incredible woman by the name of Pat McKeever had a CIHR grant to bring a lot of unusual people together. And you know, when we first met, it really felt like strange bedfellows to me. Although I have my master's in bioethics, and so I've done some work in that area, I also did a basic science postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford working on mice. So it's, you know, my head has been relatively slotted down a quantitative pathway. And when Pat brought Margaret and I together, I spoke first, and I spoke very much about the science of transplant. And then Margaret stood up, and without all of this nonsense that I brought, and she gave the most just mesmerizing talk. And I thought, I have to meet that person. She was talking about corporeality. I thought, that is just the most amazing thing, and I need to understand. And that's really how we all came together. We had lunch, and at that lunch, I conveyed a story about a patient that we had transplanted. And he is still a senior executive for a very major Canadian corporation, highly intelligent guy, postgraduate degrees, gets it, got his transplant, and about 5-6 months after the transplant, he tried to cut his heart out with a knife. And it became very clear that we were looking at something different than what we are normally used to in the way that we look at transplant. And Jean-Luc Nancy, who's a philosopher and heart transplant recipient, I think this quote really summarized much of what we started to move into, or certainly I started to move into. I think that Pat and Margaret were already there. Traditional work in quality of life in heart transplant patients is all about return to work and standard quantitative questionnaires and looking at depression and looking at anxiety, and really didn't seem to get at the type of things in the stories that we were actually hearing from patients. And we know that patients do extremely well. If you follow the standard quantitative measures, 90% of patients have no limitation after transplant. Amazing. The average survival is 10 years, and if they survive the first year, the average survival is 13 years, and we have many patients who live longer than 20 years. So it's an incredible treatment, and if you look at this, everybody does brilliantly. And that's been the modus operandi. So that's the standard dogma in transplant. And then you go from that to the other absolute extreme, which is the National Enquirer version of transplant. And you're stuck with a bit of a problem, right? So how do we actually deal with this? So when our team came together, we really had these 4 overarching questions. And this was a real departure for me, and I must say, I feel very much the better for the experience that this has been. But we asked, how did heart transplant recipients perceive their hearts, bodily integrity, and personal identity? How do they imagine and speak about their donors? How do these perceptions, thoughts, and accounts change over time? And is there a relationship between these perceptions and physical and mental outcomes? So those were the questions that we asked. And I'm going to show you some examples. So what I want you to do is to read this quote, and in your mind, I want you to think about what you think the individual saying this quote would look like. Oh, come on. It's not.
Try to think too much about the negative stuff. And you won't be prepared for what amazing things.
Clearly a little bit of a difference there between what she's saying and what she's showing. Again, I would be dead, but it's fine now. I'm completely different. I'm active. I can do anything I want.
To be dead. Well, I knew that, but
No.
you know. But now it's fine now. You know,
Yeah.
it's completely different. I'm active and I'm living, but it took a while.
And finally, this one, life is good now. It's fantastic. The last 2 years have been, I feel like I've been in a war.
What's life like now? Like, what's a typical day like for you?
I'm still adjusting, Oliver. Right now it's good. It's fantastic. The last 2 years have been I feel like I've been in a war. a battle.
And I have to say, as a team, when we watch these and we listen to what they say, which is how many of the interviews are usually done, where there's just audio taping. And if you were a researcher and you were looking at those audio tapes, you'd think, yeah, we've done it. It's great. Life's good now. It's great. And then when you watch the body language of these recipients, it's very clear that we are missing something. Most of the team required some therapy by the time we actually reviewed all of these, because you had no idea in the clinic. They don't display this behavior in the clinic when they come to see me, so this was incredibly eye-opening. And in fact, when we went through all of the interviews, 22 of the patients had some very significant form of distress, which is way more than what has ever been shown in the traditional heart transplant literature. And these were in many, many areas, but a clear disconnect between what they were saying and what we were actually seeing, if you will. And a lot of this surrounded issues of the gift and of the donor and those and guilt, fear, and anxiety. Verbal distress was the most common, but some of them were distressed throughout the entire interview. And again, these individuals didn't have a psychiatric history, and knowing them all as I did in the clinical arena, this was shocking display of change. So really what this was for us was a gentle earthquake, and not so gentle earthquake, and Margaret was there when we presented this work in my world, which is at the meeting that we've just had, the International Society for Heart-Lung Transplant, and it was a packed room, standing room only, and a lot of gasps that came from the audience, and then at the end people coming up saying, yes, we know we've been thinking that there's more and we're not seeing it. And it really became apparent that using audio-visual research allowed us to uncover much of what had been previously masked. And again, the great minds of Margaret and Pat, again, and it really is owed to them, said we need to look at innovative ways to try to actually get this information out there. There have to be different ways, and both Pat and Margaret, very connected with the artists, and the relationship between the artists and the PITH team was born. And I have to say, at the start of it, I had a great deal of trepidation. My trepidation came from this trust that I had with my patients, who trusted me with doing the study, agreeing to do the study. They consented to allowing us to show the information. And then there's these artists that are going to interpret it, and what the devil is that going to be? And I have no experience in that world, so I thought, oh my God, what are they going to show? What's it going to look like? And we came together, and I think there was a little push-pull at the beginning, and we saw their first preliminary display in Toronto, and I was blown away by the power of what they were taking these results and turning them into. And as I saw the hexagram installation, again, even more so, and I brought some of my team, one of my team who's a hardcore basic scientist, only got to the second exhibit and had to leave because she broke down completely, feeling the power. And you live in this world, most of you are from that area, so you feel the power of that regularly. I know the power of the treatment and the power of the saving of the lives, but watching this change and transformation of what the artists have been able to do has been just a big earthquake for me, and one of the best associations I've had in my 20-year career. So I wanted to give you the background so that you understood the science, a little bit about what patients go through, and then maybe we can take it from there. And just so you can laugh, this is my idea of art, because this is as far as I can do. But this is, these are words that patients said when asked to speak about their donors. Thank you.